Hello and welcome to the message for 12th of December. I do hope you're doing okay. In 1994, late in the year, I came to Grace. She lived just a short distance from the church office and had asked me to go and see her because she had something important to discuss with me. Without knowing what it was, I went to her home and she asked me to set aside 2 weeks early the following year, and she gave me the dates. And she asked me to clear my diary of any commitments and to take no other commitments at all for that time. And I said to her, and she was braced for this, of course, that I have a duty to manage my time responsibly and that I couldn't make a 2 week commitment of time without some idea of what I was committing that time for. But she resolutely refused to tell me, said I wasn't to know at this point, I was to trust. Well, we argued for quite a while. I can be fairly obstinate, I prefer to think of it as well, determined, and she could be very obstinate. I think she'd been chosen for this job by others because of the nature of our friendship. Our children and foster children knew Grace as Grandma Grace, and she had a particular role within our family life that allowed her the particular authority that went with that title. We argued. But eventually she looked me square in the eye, as it were, and she told me, "You just have to trust me. I am promising you that you will not regret this decision. It will be proven a good decision. You just can't know the detail yet, but you do need to trust me." And I found that by the time I'd left the house, I had promised those 2 weeks without having a clue as to what I was keeping this 2 weeks aside for. Not only that, but I'd committed that Carol would do the same, and I wasn't in any kind of position to do that. Anyway, the commitment was made. And for some time, I remained completely ignorant of what that time was set aside for. It turned out that she and a number of the other women in the church had an idea and had got together and had hatched this plan, shared it with more and more people in the church outside of all official machinery, etc., and were ready to put the plan into action. It just needed Carol and me to be free for 2 weeks. So I pressed, and eventually said, "The time has come, I can tell you what it is. We're sending you on a visit to the Holy Land." She was so pleased. I was gobsmacked. Nothing like that had been in my head at all. I'd got some other ideas, but they weren't anything like that. So I said to her, "So, okay, what do I do next?" She said, "You, on the date and time I've given you, you turn up at the airport with whatever you want to carry to Israel for 2 weeks and your passport. That's it." And I said, well, obviously, when you travel internationally, etc., you need to think about some other things. You need to carry some money, maybe some insurance. There's a lot of things to think about. She said, "There's nothing for you to think about. That is all seen to. You don't need to take any money. You don't need to think again. You just have to turn up at the airport with your 2 passports and get on the flight, and the rest will just happen." And so it did. And it stands out to Carol and I as one of the great treats of life that has come our way, one of the great joys. And not least because, the trip itself was fantastic, but not least because of the love and the grace, literally, that was in that gift. Why do I share this with you as part of an unfolding of Isaiah chapter 11? Thank you, Neil, for reading that for us. At a time of Christmas when there are so many Christmassy things to talk about, and I haven't mentioned it yet. This is why. Because at Christmas we routinely read these words from Isaiah chapter 11, and they're a promise. And there's something I want to impress upon us this week about the nature of promise. It applies to the promises of God, but it applies to promise in general, you see. Grace had made a promise to me that I could trust her with something I didn't understand and with something I had no real detail on. And then when a bit more detail became evident to me, I thought that I had to do more than I really had to do. But here's the thing about a promise. It nearly always involves some participation by the person or people or world to whom the promise is made. A promise is a personal thing. It is not a prediction of future events in any simple way. It is a person-to-person commitment to make something happen. And Isaiah says God is making a person-to-person's commitment that something is going to happen. And here is what's going to happen. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. So what Isaiah says, I'm going to draw you a picture first and foremost. Imagine a tree has been cut down. Well, that's like the line of David, the kings of Israel. They were cut down, and we haven't had one of David's line on the throne for ages. Jesse, the stump of Jesse. Jesse is David's dad. So it's the household of Jesse, or the household of the royal line of King David. Somebody who will trace their descendancy back to their ancestor David and Jesse. Will come and have, and something will happen as a result. You can look at a tree stump, can't you, and think, well, it's finished. But with some species, it's not at all finished. If you leave the stump in, what actually happens is not the death of the tree, but it'll regrow. And with some species, you and I both know that happens. Well, Isaiah's saying, that's God's promise. And that's what's going to happen. And it may not look likely or possible to you right now, because at the time of Isaiah it really didn't look likely. This is what Isaiah then goes on to promise on God's behalf about this person who's a descendant of King David. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, fear, and knowledge of the Lord. And he unfolds more of this vision about how this person from the line of David will make decisions for the poor of the earth, and how this person will have a kingdom of justice and of fairness and of goodness and of peace. And then Isaiah breaks into another poem image, which is a bit like the Garden of Eden in my mind. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, a little child will lead them, etc., etc., till the climax at the end of the poem. The earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as waters cover the sea. So there's this coming king from the line of David, whose passion will be for justice and all of the things that belong to the knowledge and fear of the Lord. And then the fruit of that comes up from the stump of Jesse, as is that the final outcome of justice, fairness, and all the things of God will be so filling the earth that it is like the water covering the sea. The sea is what it is because the water covers it. The earth will be what it is because of the reign of this person who will bring justice and peace around. Hundreds of years later, there's a girl in a town that nobody much has ever heard of. She's a young woman, teenager, probably. So she's in effect, a powerless person. She hasn't got any wealth. She doesn't have anything in the way of an education. She doesn't have any influence. She's not married to anybody important. The men have all the power of decision. She doesn't have anything like that. Men will make decisions about her life, is her experience and expectation. But God comes to her and with a message through the angel that says to her, I've got a promise for you. And when the promise is delivered, she's a bit like me arguing with Grace. She's saying, well, I don't understand. What am I committing to here? What is this? And I don't understand how it can happen. And the message is, just trust it, please. This is the promise. And she buys into the promise. And she buys in very personally. This promise will involve a change in her to pregnancy. This will be immensely personal. This promise will come out of her own being. The powerless one, the woman in a man's world, the peasant girl, the teenager, somebody from no place in particular. And she bursts out in great joy as Luke tells it to us. Luke chapter 1. You'll know it because it's routinely rehearsed in preparation for Christmas. Mary's song is sometimes called the Magnificat, in which she bursts out in terms very much like Isaiah chapter 11. So she says, I glorify the Lord, I rejoice in God, my Saviour. God's mercy extends from generation to generation, scattering the proud, bringing down rulers, lifting up the humble, and helping his people. And what she's saying is, at last, through this thing that I don't even understand how it can happen, the world is going to be blessed. What I love about her is that she doesn't go, oh, I'm going to be rich, famous, a celebrity and get lots of gigs and so on. She doesn't go, I'm going to have lots of power. She says, I'm blessed, but the world is blessed. And what's really exciting about this is, yes, it's exciting for me that God has called me and invited me to participate in his promise. And so I'm glad to participate. But what's exciting for me is the outcome of that participation and where this is all headed. Peace for the world, justice, and the healing of creation is wonderful. She's so excited about those things. Well, without the agency of the male decision makers and power breakers and power holders, Mary becomes the most famous woman in the world because it is through her willingness to participate in the promise that the Saviour, Jesus Christ, is born. And it's God's invitation to us to follow her and make ourselves available to participate in the great promise of the one descended from David, through whom what we so urgently need and desperately need in our time, I mean, like no generation before us, do we know that we need saving. And God's saying, I'm making you a promise. I want you to participate in it and get involved. God bless you. Have a great Christmas if I don't speak to you before then. And don't forget, the promise is for sharing and participating in justice, fairness for the poor, the healing of the earth. This is the stuff that we're to join in with, in the sure and certain knowledge that God is going to save. God bless you.